Serious people who have met or dealt with Donald Trump in person prior to the race. What was he like? I've posted this before. Donald Trump came into the movie theater I used to work at, and I served him at the concession stand. He asked about the flavors of our slushes. They were white cherry and cotton candy. He got the cotton candy. Donald Trump enjoys cotton candy, and I literally know that for a fact forever now. He also paid in exact change. When I was a kid I was friends with a very wealthy kid. We went to the same boxing gym. He was the son of someone very important in California, probably an oil mogul or something. One day we were invited to a barbecue to celebrate his birthday, and arriving there his dad takes us on a tour of the giant house and introduces us to all the other guests who were his friends. One of those guests was Mr. Donald Trump. I shook his hand, and he said, "Ow, that's a pretty solid handshake." I said thanks, and he asked me if I happened to be Samoan, because I was pretty strong for a 14-year-old. I said my family was from New Zealand, and thus was of Maori descent. He said that's nice. I always wanted to go to New Zealand. Then he told us to study hard and work hard, so we all could live in big houses like our hosts when we grew up. Then he went back to talking to the other people. I never talked to him, but I was at a party he attended about 18 months ago. He wasn't rude at all, just odd. He told a story about how Bill Gates once told a room of people that he, Donald, was really smart and had good ideas. It felt weirdly self-conscious on his part. I also met his helicopter pilots, who said that he was a nice guy, always making sure they were taken care of, had eaten, etc. The pilots said the megadouche was his son, Eric. My mom was on a design team when he was building one of his many golf courses like 15 years ago, so she saw him every day. He and Melania hadn't married yet, but they were also in the midst of designing a new estate he had just bought. Tiffany was little and always came into the office with them, but she was basically glued to Melania's hip. They were really close. I was also small, but sometimes if I came into the office to visit my mom, Tiffany and I would play, but I don't remember what she was like. Apparently Trump was a really decent guy. He once turned to my mom and said, "You're a designer," and asked about if their kitchen was in a 2-dimension. What kind of cabinets should they have? My mom was like, "Oh, obviously cherry," and Melania turned to Trump and said, "Ha," and he was like, "Alright, okay, you win." My mom says back then he was pleasant and professional. I also think it's interesting to add that my mom also swears that he was planning his run for president all the way back then, and she overheard them all the time casually mentioning it. Trump owns a golf resort in Scotland not far from my home, and he was speaking at a Chambers of Commerce meeting a couple of years ago, catered by students of the local cookery college, of which I was one. We did little canapes and nibbles, nothing major, but he popped in and thanked us for our efforts and said he enjoyed the food, which was nice of him. He built a golf course in a rich neighboring town a few years ago, and around the time it opened my grandparents and I were on a walk there. It was built on a sea cliff, popular hiking spot, before it was built, still is though, and Trump was riding by on a golf cart. He high-fived my grandma. No words were exchanged. Not sure if it counts as having met him, but about 2 years ago I was walking out of this public atrium space that's right near Trump Tower and the IBM building, and we saw him and some other businessmen walk out of Trump Tower. Someone around us yelled out, "Hey Trump, you're fired," and he looked over and gave us the classic Donald thumbs up and got into a black SUV. Back in darker days I worked for a Chick-fil-A in California. I was working the drive-thru and took an order from an obvious chauffeur driving one of those black livery sedans. When he pulled up to the window, he handed me exact change, then pulled forward a bit. When I went to hand the food through, Mr. Trump lowered the back window, took the food, and said, "Thanks very much," before they rolled away. I was pretty surprised. I bumped into him on the street in 2014. I was looking at my watch and ran into him by accident as he was getting out of his car in front of his building. I apologized. He said it was quite alright, and we went our separate ways. It was very civil, all things considered. I saw him speak at an AskReddit convention. The only thing I remember is there was a Q and A part. Some 20-something girl asks if his hair was real, and he says it was, and then asks the girl to come on stage and feel it. So Trump had a younger woman rubbing his head in front of 200 real estate professionals. Did work for one of his golf courses in California. He signed a bunch of shirts that said "You're fired." The Donald on it. He actually seemed pretty reserved and easygoing. Definitely not the persona he portrayed while running for president. I went to school with his daughter Tiffany, so I had a few interactions with the Donald and all were positive. The one anecdote that I'll share is from the school plays. Tiffany was involved in the school theater program, and so was my brother, so I was usually helping out as an usher for the plays. Donald attended all the plays that were put on despite living across the country from our school in La. The thing that was most impressive was how he arrived to the plays. He was always late, just 1 minute late. He'd arrive and take his seat in the rear just after the house lights went down, so he didn't draw any attention away from the kids. He'd slip out as quietly as he'd arrived. When he was at the school, his focus was 100% on his daughter and not himself. Despite living in a pretty solid liberal area, most people from that school admit that it's kind of hard to square our experiences with him up with the media's portrayal of him as a brash, egotistical idiot. A couple of years ago I went to a conference in Las Vegas. My company put me up at Trump Hotel. Because my company is cheap and the hotel is technically off the strip, I was sure the hotel would be second rate. I was impressed with the rooms and lobby, the quality of drinks and the free entertainment in the lounge. As I was passing near the elevators, I saw a few tall men standing around in suits swarily eyeing passers-by. I stopped to survey the situation and suddenly realized Donald Trump was right next to me. I said to him with sincerity, "Beautiful hotel you have here, Mr. Trump." He responded by taking a step closer and extending his hand. I shook it, and he looked me in the face and said, "Thank you. That's why we built it. We want people to come to Las Vegas, have a nice time, and stay in a nice hotel." He gave me a smile and turned to take pictures and chat with the growing crowd. He seemed very genuine and pleasant. 10/10. I worked at one of his golf courses for 3 years as a valet, and I also upkept the practice facilities, including driving around the ball picker-upper. Every time I dealt with Big Donald, he was more than respectful. Also, we had a Mexican guy who cleaned carts, Felipe, who he personally provided housing for out of his own pocket, because he thought Felipe was such a good worker and valuable asset to the course, which he was. The guy was such a nice guy and a crazy good worker. All in all, I had a polar opposite view of who Donald Trump was prior to this election cycle. I was in Nick visiting family when I took a walk through Central Park, and I sat down at a bench with a couple sodas. I'm relaxing with some music, admiring all the good times people are having, and I feel someone sit down next to me breathing a little hard, like they just took a really long walk or something. I turn and it's actually the Don. He asks if he could have a Coke, because he was kinda thirsty, so I gave him one of mine. We talk for like 2 to 3 minutes when a guy comes up behind him and whispers something in his ear, and he says he has to go and hands me a 20 and told me something like, "If you need something, don't be afraid to jump at an opportunity." The whole time I'm just kinda sitting there starstruck, like what just happened. Everybody was turning their heads when he walked to his car with the other guy, and a few were looking at me like I was a somebody, and I'm just sitting there confused about everything. He seemed like a reserved guy, pretty chill, and he had a love for that park because he talked about how he took his kids there a lot when they were younger. He showed up at my cousin's sweet 16 party roughly 7 or 8 years ago. It was at a ballroom at a golf club he owned. He walked in and took pictures with us for maybe 10 minutes. I doubt he actually needed to do any of that. Seemed like a pleasant enough guy. Edit. Since y'all seem to be focusing on the creepy aspect of it, I'm male. Most of my family was in attendance, including her parents, and it was more of a check-in / meet and greet to see if everything was alright. This was also in the first couple of seasons of The Apprentice, so to see a guy from TV as well as whatever else Trump was at the time was impressive. Side note, when I was leaving I saw his Rolls Royce, completely white, which was not to my taste, and I only remember it because it had Florida plates, and this club was in New Jersey, which was probably for one of those snowbird type tax reasons. I've played golf at one of his courses in Florida a few times. He's usually there having lunch with his typical group. When they finish, he makes a point to walk around to all of the tables, shake hands and say hello. Always very nice. Since he didn't make a fortune in tech, I imagine he has gotten to where he is by being pretty charismatic. When I was 13, I was invited to a friend's bar mitzvah, and the party was at the clubhouse of one of Trump's golf courses. He was actually there a bit during the cocktail party, checking on the parents of the bar mitzvah boy to make sure everything was up to snuff for them. Shook a lot of people's hands, said hello to everyone. Honestly, my best memory of a celebrity. About 13 years ago, my mom brought my brother and I to New York because one of her friends let her stay in her house. We were from Ireland, so this was a big deal and a big expense. My brother was around 5 or 6 and stressing my mom out because he was complaining and acting up for the whole week. We were walking down some random street in New York and my brother was having a temper tantrum and my mom was shouting at him. He had a SpongeBob SquarePants toy in his hand and threw it at her. She ducked and it nearly hit Donald Trump, who was also on the street. He just laughed and said, "Oh, there goes SpongeBob." I worked at one of his resorts last year. I interacted with his whole family consistently, and some of them were always really nice. Only saw him a handful of times just coming by the pool to shake hands and gather massive amounts of ice cream, or at banquets. I worked at the golf course. The only time he spoke to me, I was monitoring the buffet to keep it full. He walked in with a hamburger on his plate, turned to me, and asked, "Where can I get some French fries?" I pointed to the French fries. I also know people he personally defrauded for contractor work, but that's neither here nor there. The only thing I can attest to with my own eyes is that he eats like a 12-year-old me. Maybe 23 years ago, I was taking a class in college where we had to go to a city planning meeting. The one I went to, they were discussing some Trump project, and many of the locals were unhappy about it. So there's some talking and arguing, and then Trump walks in. It was a crowded room, but everyone realized when he came in. One thing I noticed was how big he was. Not fat, just like larger than life. He's tall, but there was something about him that made him seem even bigger. Anyway, at one point some lady was literally screaming right at him, and he was standing there not even looking at her. It was hilarious. So I had the opportunity to go up to him and ask him to autograph a copy of the meeting agenda. I gave him my pen, which was weirdly designed. It had a cap on it, but the bottom had a silver thing that looked like a button but wasn't. So he's pushing it like it's a button and can't get the pen to work. So I took the cap off and he signed the agenda. This was pre-apprentice, so know you're fired, just his name. And then I lost his autograph almost immediately. And that's my story. I used to be a cable tech in Nick, and we would service Trump Tower on occasion. I got to replace the cable box in his living room and show him how to use on demand to watch a movie. Made a joke about how he hates the company I worked for, even though he's an investor. He then said thank you and had his assistant hand me a nice tip before we parted ways. Got 10s on the automated survey call after I finished the job, but I'm not sure if he's the one to thank for that, since I doubt he put his number down when opening the account up. Very New York story. I'm eating dinner at the Silver Star Diner on 2nd Avenue in Nick. This is about 1993. At the table next to me is comedian Jackie Mason. The diner has floor-to-ceiling windows and outside walks by Trump, Mola Maples, Trump's parents and couple of other people. Trump sees Mason and walks in and heads to the table. On the way over, his father bumps into my table and knocks over my water. He apologizes and I say it's okay. Mola actually grabs some napkins and starts cleaning it. Trump goes on about what a horror it is, clearly joking, and says he will buy me a new water, as many as you want. Then Jackie Mason goes on for 20 minutes about how cheap Trump is. He has the whole diner in stitches. Trump jokes it's not his fault because he just gave Ivana a whole lot of money. Donald takes it well, but he leaves about halfway through smiling and waving at everyone.